a lot of why I was struggling so much was I was overworking. And so it's just ridiculous to think the way to work through overworking is by working harder. Like that.
I would bet large amounts of money that that's a common response. I know it sounds ridiculous when you say it, but I don't think it's that uncommon.
Yeah, it's kind of like, we were talking about building computers. It's like a memory leak where you have some sort of recursive thing going on inside your operating system, and it's just eating up all the resources. But you're like, but this is how it was designed. It's not supposed to, you don't want this result, but this is how we have achieved up until then. And so if you end up in this situation, you just end up running yourself into the ground because that is how you are designed.
Welcome to Think Bigger, Think Better, where we explore how you can apply insights from visionary leaders and the most provocative philosophers and scientists of our time to make your life and our world a better place. Here's your host, author and speaker, Paul Gibbons.
And hey, this is Paul Gibbons. Great to be back, and thank you for tuning in. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and share. Think Bigger, Think Better is looking for a sponsor, probably a not-for-profit, a family office. If listeners are connected to Bezos, Gates, or Soros, or another foundation, have them hit me up. Now, returning listeners will know that we've covered depression with clinical psychologist Steve Holland back in the day. Please check that podcast out. Interesting. Today, we talked to Newton Cheng, who's a Google executive, a power lifter, and a dad. After a struggle, which I'll let him describe, he became an advocate and activist and a keynote speaker on mental health at work. He is Director of Health and Performance at Google. Born and raised in Macomb, Illinois, he earned a Bachelor's of Science in Electrical Engineering from the University of Illinois and an MBA from Berkeley. He spent 15 years at Google developing, launching, and scaling programs aimed at helping Googlers to thrive. Today, he oversees a global portfolio of Google's physical and digital health and well-being amenities. He's the father of 2 young girls and has set world, U.S., and state records for powerlifting and is a 4-time national champion in the United States. His goal is to offer a different model of vulnerable leadership that inspires culture change in the workplace so that we can take better care of ourselves and others. And welcome, Newton, to Think Bigger, Think Better. How you doing?
I'm good. Very happy to be here, Paul. Thanks for having me.
I'm happy to see you. And I gathered that you're going to give Taylor Swift a run for her money with something that happened on social recently.
Well, so I'm discovering there's echelons of, I think there's echelons of influencer status on Instagram. So
right.
What's happening right now is I posted a reel about 2 weeks ago where all it was I just filmed myself kind of walking through the dark halls of an office. And I was arriving at the office at, I think it was about 4:50 a.m. I said 4:30 a.m. and that was not accurate. And now people are calling me on it because it's Instagram. But so about 4:50 a.m. And I said, I'm getting in super early, not because I'm super committed, but because I didn't plan well. And it was just an acknowledgement of like, hey, we have stuff to do. I knew it was coming. I didn't plan well, and now I'm behind. Now I have to get in super early. And I posted that 2 weeks ago. Normally what happens is I get, let's say, 1,000 plays on a reel, and then let's say 50 likes. It was quiet for about 2 weeks, and then in the last few days, it's just started escalating. And now it's at almost 1 million plays and I think almost 15,000 likes. And so that's one thing. And then I found out the Taylor Swifts of the world get about 25 million plays. So I got a ways to go.
You do.
Well, 1 million's not too shabby.
But what's your theory about what resonates with people about the message? Like, what was the message?
Yeah, so I started asking people really directly, at first kind of tongue-in-cheek. I just started posting stories saying, who reposted this? Was it Oprah? Was it The Rock? I had people vote on it. Interestingly, the person who won the poll of who reposted it was Goku, which is a fictional anime character who does not actually can't post anything on Instagram, but that's who people voted for. But then people started direct messaging me and saying, hey, the reason that I followed you was, well, one, Instagram just fed it to me in my feed. And the reason I followed you was because you're saying a lot of the things that a lot of us feel out loud. You're being transparent, and it seems like you're being authentic. And I don't see other people doing that. And, you know, I think there's some truth to that. Now, an interesting other reaction that's happened that you won't get on, say, a LinkedIn because there's a professional decorum was I found the boundary of where this message doesn't resonate. Can I swear on this podcast?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. So some people say don't look at your comment section.
Yeah,
I actually love looking at the comment section to see where does the shit talking start and why. Because that's the edge of who you can engage in positive ways.
Yeah.
And you know, we were talking about resistance on another discussion thread somewhere. And so it's like seeing like, that's the resistance. That's where whatever I put out there, it sparked engagement, but not the type I want. And why did that happen? And so it's interesting. Some people are saying, I love that you're being authentic and I love that you're being transparent. Other people are saying, this is performative horse shit where you are propping up a culture of, someone actually used the term corporate slavery.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And and so it's super fascinating to me.
I can imagine. Do you want to, for people who don't know you, and I dare say there'll be a few, tell them what's the story? What's your story? You can go back to birth if you like, but maybe, you know, even going back to teenage years or going back to your workplace years. Like, what's the story? Like, how did we get to where we are? And what was the sort of, I don't want to call it an epiphany, but what was that big moment that kind of shifted things for you in your life?
Yeah, so I'll start with like the framing I always give of where I am today, and then we'll dial back to to where I started and how those two things might connect.
Cool.
So today, I think of my life in three big roles: family man, I'm a competitive powerlifter, and I'm a leader in this field of health and performance, where I'm really interested in driving culture change and creating this culture of well-being that enables people to take better care of themselves and each other, specifically around work.
Yeah.
And so those are the three big roles. I'm director of health and performance at Google. Back on the athlete bucket, I'm a world champion powerlifter, so taking that pretty far. And then I've been married for, I got married in 2009. Married for 13 years, and then I have two wonderful daughters via adoption.
And you lift it's like 600 pounds. You're like 550 pounds, right? Just for people who don't know like what powerlifters do, it's a ridiculous looking amount of weight.
My probably most ridiculous lift is I have deadlifted 562 pounds at a body weight of 125 pounds.
Yeah. So it's incredible.
Yeah, at the young age of 45, which is considered old in powerlifting terms, even though I feel pretty good.
So that's 3.5 times your body weight, give or take.
4.5.
4.5 times your body weight.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a lot. So that's like me. That would be like me lifting a car. Something like that. Anyway, all right, good. So those are your three roles in life. And then a couple of years ago, pandemic time, some of the shit hit the fan personally for you. So what do you want to say about that?
Yeah. So during the pandemic, like so many others, I really started to struggle with my mental health. As we went into the pandemic, I kind of leaned in and said, this is when you show up as a leader and you try to lead and you try to take care of others. And so my team and I, we took on more work. We spent more time checking in with one another. But then ultimately, it became kind of unsustainable. And so if the pandemic began in March, it was about around summer of that same year, 2020, where I was in a meeting with my vice president and his team. We're all on video chat. So we're all in our thumbnail boxes. And we were doing these check-ins. And we're just answering the question, how are you doing? And it got to me, and someone sent me a little chat message and said, hey, I feel like people aren't really being real. Can you say something real? And, so, up until then, just for background, like I am a straight Asian American male who was raised in a small farm town in the Midwest. Like I do not have any drop of socialization in me to be vulnerable to talk about mental health openly, especially in the workplace.
Right. Yeah.
And so it got to me, and I started pondering, like in milliseconds, like, okay, what is real for me right now? What is real? And the big surprise to me was I started to cry. And I said, right now I'm struggling because the number of days that I'm proud of how I'm showing up as a father is going down, and I don't know how to turn that around. And that was horrifying to me for two reasons. One, I talked about how I had been socialized, and I was socialized not to ever do that. Don't show vulnerability. Don't show weakness. Definitely never cry as a man, and then don't cry at work.
Right.
And I did all of that.
You broke so many of these cultural taboos. You did it all, right?
Yes, it was the royal flush.
Trash them all, right?
Yeah, of cultural taboos as a straight Asian American male raised in the Midwest. And then the second thing was, once I said those words out loud, I had never articulated why I was feeling struggle so clearly. But once I put those words on the table, it was like the first time I had heard them myself. But I knew they were 100% true. And I knew I didn't know how to get out of that situation.
Yeah.
So that was my first big, like, this is a red flag. Like, you are not in a good place and you don't know how to get out of it.
But you didn't quit right then and there, right? You kept at it for a little bit, right?
No, I went back into my normal way of being, which was to shove that down and say, okay, we're going to use mental toughness and grit. We're going to power through this. It's going to get better.
Yeah, we're going to double down. Yeah. I need to work harder.
Yes.
I just need to work harder. It'll all be good.
Yes.
It's right. I'm joking. I'm laughing. But that when people are hyperachievers, we'll talk about this when we get into the recovery phase. That's their superpowers. And it's our comfort zone to do those things that we excel at, So, if you're a very charismatic leader, and this is the trouble I had when I was leading a small company of 50 people, and charisma and persuasion and inspiration, those are kind of superpowers. But when times get really tough, it's not what people want to hear, or at least they don't want to hear it first. They want you to be where they are, to get what they are, which is anxious. We're freaked out. I think this was 2008. The recession's going to hit. We're not going to have jobs and everything like that. And I was there doing my cheerleader, like rah, rah, rah thing and talking very rationally about economic circumstances and how, we're at the bottom and everything like that. And it just felt like a wet balloon. So doing what we do naturally and super duper well, when times get tough, we tend to do more of that. It's not always the right move, right? I mean, that's the thing. It's not the right move. And I think when we get further into your story, I happen to know that when one of your things was you were going to plan and work your way out of not feeling well. And maybe that's not the answer, right? Because that's your superpower. That's your superpower.
I mean, the way I think about it is a lot of why I was struggling so much was I was overworking. And so it's just ridiculous to think the way to work through overworking is by working harder. Like that,
you would be, I would bet large amounts of money that that's a common response. I know it sounds ridiculous when you say it, but I don't think it's that uncommon.
Yeah, it's kind of like, we were talking about building computers. It's like a memory leak where you have some sort of recursive thing going on inside your operating system, and it's just eating up all the resources. But you're like, but this is how it was designed. It's not supposed to, you don't want this result, but this is how we have achieved up until then. And so if you end up in this situation, you just end up running yourself into the ground because that is how you are designed.
And it's important to note, like, we get a lot of goodies from, one of the things when I did some therapy way back in the day, 25 years ago or something, and we were talking about some I can't remember what flaw in my character. He said, you're going to get a lot of goodies from that flaw in your character, whatever that flaw was. I can't remember what it was. It was overworking, something like that. Like, you say you want to get rid of it. And so I mean, you get a lot of good stuff out of that, right? Like whatever it is, it's wealth or success or fame or whatever it is, right? Yeah. So we get a lot of goodies from our neuroses, which is one of the things that keeps them in place, I believe.
Totally. Yeah. Well, let me continue with the story.
Go. Sorry, we segued. Yeah, go on.
So exactly what you were saying. I thought, you know what? I will use mental toughness and grit. I will work harder to get through this period where I am overworked. And what I found was, that meeting I talked about, that was in the summer. By November, that's when I first started to feel like I was just struggling to get out of bed.
Yeah.
By February, that was the first time there was a morning where I physically could not get out of bed because I was just overwhelmed with this sense of dread. And that was another huge aha for me, because 10 years before that, there's a former VP from Google, Daryl Heinrich, who's been very open about his struggles with mental health and depression. He talked about having this experience of not being able to get out of bed when he was overwhelmed with depression. And I had heard that story 10 years ago, and it didn't really click because I had never experienced that up until here I was 10 years later struggling to get out of bed. And that my brain recalled that story and said, you are probably struggling with what Derek was struggling with. I think you need professional help.
Wow. There you go.
Yeah. So he planted the seed 10 years ago.
That's cool.
10 years.
And, it's funny that about talking about planting seeds and talk about the work you're doing like on social and the work you're doing kind of raise awareness in the world or something like that. You don't know which of these seeds is going to grow into an oak and which of them. So, he's doing a lot of talking, and something he said just resonated with you somewhere down in the bowels of your limbic system or something like that. It stuck there. And then when the time has come, you sort of said, oh, wow, I can do this. This is an out for me. It's very cool.
Well, it's interesting because we know via things like marketing, for example, that a customer needs, I forget what the number is, but they need some number of touch points with information about your product. It's something like 7 or 11 before they will take action.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about something that's much deeper behavior change, like mental health, it's actually not that big a stretch to say it might take 10 years of a drip campaign for you to get behavior change with this person.
Yeah. There you are. So what happened? So how did Google react, first of all? Because I think we want to talk a little bit about the corporate side of things, like how this landed with Google. Yeah.
So I think when we say this, there's probably a few things where you'd expect, like, how might Google react? One might be when I started to tell people around me that I was struggling with mental health and I needed to take action. And that was specifically going on mental health leave. 2 was, how did they react when I went on mental health leave and then came back? And then 3, how have they reacted as I've been very public talking about my struggles with mental health, as well as trying to drive conversation about, hey, should we be having a different conversation about how we live and work? Because this does not seem to be working for many, many people. And so if I start with the first one of how did Google react when I had to start telling people I was struggling with my mental health? The way that worked was, first, I went and used the employee assistance provider provided by Google, and they set me up with a therapist, and that is a private confidential service. So technically, while I was at Google, no one knew except for a few close friends I talked to about this.
Yep.
Eventually, the therapist I was working with said that I should consider going on mental health leave. And this is where it started to get very real, because in order to do that, I'd have to tell my boss, I'd have to tell my team and my peers. And so, me having a lot of fear around this of what might this do to my career, I started asking these questions, trying to figure out, how do I frame this like in a business case type way?
Sure.
And the way that my a therapist helped me piece together a message. And I'm not saying this is the way everyone should do it, but this is the way that I did it to placate my own fears. I asked him, so what happens when you recommend to other people they go on leave? Like, what happens when they do? What happens when they don't? And he said, well, when I recommend someone goes on leave, let's say, I forget what the percentage was, but he said something like only 20% actually do it when he initially tells them to go on leave. What he finds is those people end up on leave maybe 6 to 8 weeks. They come back. A lot of the time, they're in a better place. They experience some sort of post-traumatic growth, and they show up differently at work, and they move forward with their lives.
Very good.
That's a great thing. What he finds for a lot of the other people is sometimes they work through it, but a lot of the time they end up in an even worse place. And now instead of 6 to 8 weeks out, they're out for 6 to 12 months.
Ooh. Okay.
And then the thing where he didn't really articulate the why was, and you end up in a deeply wounded place.
Yeah.
And what I took from that was, for me, the wounds, it's all about relationships. And so I started thinking about, I'm going to hurt my marriage. I'm going to hurt my relationship with my kids. Like, I can't do that. That is off the table. So I cannot go down a route where that's a possibility. So for me, that was what made me determined to say, I will take the leave sooner rather than later. And it also gave me a framing for now in a business framing to say, well, are the two choices here are go sooner and I will be out 6 to 8 weeks, or wait and I may be out 6 to 12 months, or worse if I've really screwed up my life.
Yeah, or worse, right? I mean, this doesn't always have a happy ending, right? Not at all. Not things. Very good. And Google stepped up, so 100%, right?
They did.
Give them an A+, right? I think is that right?
Google is a huge, huge company. And so I can only evaluate on like the policies and programs that were available to me and the people who I work with and how they responded. Those people stepped up in a huge, huge way. The programs, the services, they were huge for me. So I was able to go on short-term disability to take care of my mental health. There was nothing but support from my boss, from my peers, from my team. I think everyone was extremely understanding. To be fair, I took a lot on myself to say, I'm going to do everything I can to minimize the impact of my leave and to do the planning, to make sure things are delegated, to even use this as a time for stretch opportunities for other people to take on some of my responsibilities.
Yep.
And so, it wasn't like I just pieced out and disappeared one day. But I felt no resistance from anyone. I felt everyone really pushed to make sure they weren't stoking any sense of shame in me and making sure I felt like, hey, if you're going to do this, you have my back, you have my support. And I'm so grateful.
I mean, it's not for you to grade your proposal. That does sound like an A+ to me. But one of the things that we know from the fact and the data is only half the people who suffer seek help. I don't know what the numbers are at Google, maybe higher, maybe lower. I mean, Google's a very high-performing company, and there are pressures that people who work at less high-performing companies probably, don't begin to understand. So I don't know what the percentage will be at Google, but let's say half the people get help. So, and here's a theory that I have is by the time they get help, the shit has got really very bad. And so we already have people who are impaired and not only doing damage perhaps in their own lives, but also damage in the workplace. I mean, I had at one time in my life, and I don't want to say too much about this, but worked for somebody who had rather severe mental health issues. And there were 50 people working for him. And the effect of that leader's mental health issues on the people that worked for him were substantial. And I had a dozen people come to me and say, I'm not making it right now. So there you are. I mean, too few people get help. By the time they do get help, it's perhaps too late. And by the time they do get help, they've perhaps done a bunch of damage. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
You depending on the data sets you look at, you can see the rise of things, and this is not specific to Google. This is, in the business world, you can find evidence of things like increase in things like workplace hostility, substance abuse, effects on families and marriages. All of these things, maybe they're unrelated to mental health, but if you start to think of people's lives as systems, you can see that for many people, these are kind of the unintended consequences of maladaptive coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
For stress or mental health challenges that maybe aren't being dealt with either further upstream or in ways that are effective.
We certainly agree on one thing, though, that it's much more than just having a good EAP program in place. And I think I read the numbers. I'll share some. 92% of big companies have some sort of EAP in place. So that's kind of the ante these days. What I know, Google's on the front foot, and they're much more proactive, and they're thinking about resilience, and they're thinking about leadership, and they're thinking about culture and stuff like that. So what can you say about? I should say Newton's not on this podcast as an official spokesman of Google policies, so these are his personal reflections rather than a categorical statement of what precisely Google does. But what do you see that Google is trying to do that's preventative or before things get difficult for individuals?
I think one of Google's superpowers, and it's also a big challenge, is that it is massively decentralized and with a huge culture of empowerment. Yeah. And so if we, the way I discovered you and your work was via one of your books on change management. So if let's say we put this a change management lens on this, where yes, we need programs like the EAP, and we need things like short-term disability so people, if they end up in a bad place, can take care of themselves. But what are the things we got to work on upstream so that whatever system we've designed as an organization, we don't have all these mental health challenges as kind of an unintended side output of the way we run our business. So a lot of that is cultural. And so there's this big conversation around how does cultural transformation happen? And you could say that I could look at the CEO of a company like a Google or an Apple or a Meta and say, okay, all-powerful CEO, I want you to wave your wand, change our ways of working, just deem new ones, and that will enable us to have much more space in our lives to take care of ourselves. I don't think that's going to work. For a few reasons. One, the fundamental, I'll call it operating system of these companies is we need to bring together some of the world's highest achievers who have learned to drive themselves in both good and bad ways. That's not Google's fault. That's not Apple's fault. It's that's just how we are in this society. And we put them into an organization with huge, huge ambitions. And then we give them pretty much free reign, not free reign, but a lot of freedom because they are so talented to figure out how are we going to achieve these big goals. And if I frame it that way and say, do you think it's possible we might drive each other to the edge of what's sustainable as humans? Yeah, that's probably going to happen. It's probably going to happen.
Yeah. And
so the CEO can't just wave their wand and say, no, we're going to change things, because the entire organization is designed, it's doing what it's designed to do. And so there's going to have to be more gradual culture change over time. And that's going to require a lot of experimentation throughout parts of the organization to figure out what's right, what's a different way of doing this, what works and what doesn't. So what I see with Google is that not just since the pandemic, but for over 10 years, they've kept a constant drumbeat, and this goes from all the way at a grassroots level, all the way up to the CEO, of saying we need higher awareness around mental health. We need better support for people's mental health. We acknowledge we don't know how, like, we're not perfect. We don't know how to magically fix these things, but we need to keep trying. And that as a foundation, if you have that as a foundation, you have this acknowledgement of it's going to take a lot of time and experimentation across the system. I don't know how you would do much better than that. Like, yeah, it's uncomfortable, and like, yeah, I'd like things to be better faster, but I don't know how you would drive change. What would you would do realistically to drive change faster?
It's funny. There's so many layers to this as well. I mean, one of the things is, of course, we live in a capitalist world, so the superordinate, purpose of organizations is to make money. And one way of looking after employees' mental health and helping them do that for themselves and providing support and changing your culture where perhaps overwork isn't such a culturally acceptable norm, and whatever these things you want to do, is that they could be damaging to the bottom line, and that's unacceptable and certainly damaging to the bottom line in the short term. But what we find with really forward-thinking organizations around, do we want to be an inclusive culture? Do we want to focus on diversity and inclusion? But will that cost us money? Do we not be hiring the best people? That's an argument. I saw one of these future of work gurus who I had a lot of admiration to this particular post, who said that, we need to get over ourselves with the DEI and we need to get back to a meritocracy. And of course I said, well, never been a meritocracy on the planet, bro. But you find me one. But but that's one thing. But these aren't win-lose zero-sum games. So you're not a sustainable company, but you don't have a zero-sum game between sustainability and making money, between diversity and inclusion and making money, between mental health and making money. That's a way of thinking that is old school and deficient. And we can find ways of making ourselves a more robust, more resilient, more profitable, better place to work by doing the right things. And isn't that a wonderful thing? I mean, it sounds almost like super idealistic. Is like, we can do the right thing here and make money for our shareholders. And
yes.
Sometimes it sounds like that's too good to believe. That's like, what was that book, Candide, right? The best of all possible worlds. You live in a dream world, bro. It's not the way the real world works. But, I'd like to believe it does, right? And I think you'd like to believe it does too.
Yes. Yeah. For Candide, just one side reference. I never actually read the book, but I got to play the trumpet solo in the overture
right.
for the musical all the way back in high school. So it has a special place.
Way back in the day, yeah.
But I think I see this as when we end up demanding that the system change in ways that, like, if your solution can be framed as we need to burn the current system down and build a new one, I'm kind of already out of the conversation.
Yeah.
Because I just don't think that's the way forward. Like, you burn the system down. It's not like the system's producing zero value. It's producing a lot of value and helping a lot of people right now.
Right.
So yeah. I don't think that's the right solution in almost every scenario I can think of.
I don't think it is true, and I just don't think it'll ever happen. I mean, I don't think we'll ever have, if you did decide that the right way to proceed to get out of capitalism was to burn down capitalism, and there'd be 300 million people in the United States would starve,
Yes.
You can't deal with that kind of.
I think we're all waiting for the moment in Star Wars where someone launches a missile and blows up the Death Star, and we all cheer, and now the universe is better.
Don't see it.
Yeah, I see like so much of how we get stuck in this conversation as it's more a challenge of our own abilities to acknowledge the complexity of the system, to say, yes, the lifeblood of these organizations in capitalist society, it's money, but that's not disconnected from conversations around mental health and DEI. It's really hard to measure those things and to understand them, but we can't deny that these things are connected because they're human systems, and those things are all describing parts of humanity. And so that's where I have a great respect for these companies like Google, like the Apples of the world. Like, yeah, they don't have it all together, but despite the financial challenges the world is going through, they continue to make space for these conversations as an acknowledgement of these things are connected.
Indeed. I'm a radical and a reformer, but I also have been, considered to be a bit of a maverick, but I've been in the business world since 1980. And I will say, while we aren't quote unquote there yet, to talk about sustainability in the 1980s, you would have been thought as a moron. To talk about people finding meaning and purpose in their work and a deeper connection to their work in the 1980s, you would have been thought of as a flake. To talk about diversity and inclusion as being an important metric for businesses in the 1980s, you would have, again, been ridiculed. And so all of these things that we take for granted as being normal conversations now, and as I say, we're not there yet, but capitalism is unrecognizably different in the sorts of things we're allowed to talk about inside capitalist societies and inside capitalist corporations. And ain't nobody more capitalist than Google, right? I mean, you all making some cheddar back there.
Yeah. Google's business model seems pretty effective.
Yeah. So I'm kind of like, if I look backward, I'm a real optimist that we're going to be able to reform the system from within and without giving up, without putting 200 million people out of work as we blow up the Death Star, so to speak.
Yeah, I think I was at a conference speaking on a panel on mental health, and I told my story about my own struggles with mental health. And afterwards, one of the panelists came up to me, and he's, I think maybe 2 decades older than me. And he said, I really respect what you did. There was a time in my working life where if someone had done that, they would have instantly been fired.
Instantly.
Yeah. And so just thinking about, we've gone from that to where I'm being invited on a panel to do that and to be applauded. My company paid for me to go be on that panel.
Yeah.
The audience applauded that while I was on the panel. Like, that's a huge amount of change.
It is a matter of change. I had my own struggles in the 1980s. I mean, I was a heavy drinker on Wall Street. Not that I was the only one, but I was more impaired than most. And when they found out, they were just like, "You're done. See you later." Doesn't matter how. And that was the attitude. There was no second thought like maybe we should offer this guy some help or try and save his career or anything like that. And I'm not bitter about that. That's the way world. In fact, that sort of stuff happening to me is what got me to recover 30 odd years ago, is that sort of thing. So, but there we are. Here we are. Where we're deep into it here. I think we set ourselves a goal for an hour. I don't want to be strict about that. What I do want to ask you is, well, there are a couple of wave the wand questions. Like, where's the leading edge, do you think, for organizations and for the world in the field of mental health? I mean, it's an expansive question, so have at it.
So it's hard for me to say this is what's right for organizations, but I'll say this is what I'm experimenting with right now. And so what I am trying to do is say, like, where is that edge? I'm going to dance up to that edge. I might take a step over that edge and see what happens, because there's no data over the edge. It's kind of like we're trying to figure out what's inside this black hole, where it's like we don't know what's beyond the event horizon.
We don't.
But I've decided, you know what? I'm just going to put one leg beyond the event horizon. I'm going to take one step, and I'll see if my leg comes back.
What does that look like?
So for me, first it was just to put my story out there.
Okay.
And so I did coming back from mental health leave. I said, I know the data around how many are struggling. I've talked to a lot of people. I don't think this is the culture that any of us wants, but we're all silencing each other due to this stigma that we've created for one another. And so I said, if I have the opportunity to tell my story, I'm going to do it. And just kind of like that, the universe popped up an opportunity. And a friend of mine runs a podcast on men's mental health. And he had me on, and I told my story as openly and honestly as possible. And then this is where I took a step into the black hole to see, okay, what's going to happen?
Right. It doesn't have to have a happy ending, right?
Yeah. So he doesn't have a huge following, but once the podcast was posted, first I posted it on Instagram and Facebook, and I got lots of applause and positive support.
Yeah.
But then I thought, well, aren't you trying to drive change in the workplace? So shouldn't you post this on LinkedIn in front of your professional network? And
that's the black hole right up in there.
That was the black hole. I thought, my initial reaction was hell no. And then the value-driven side of my brain said, but you know what the right thing to do is if you're being true to your values. And so I spent like an evening drafting a post. I mean, my wife read it.
Like the first one, right? The first post is like, I'm going to spend a long time on this bad boy.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I posted it, and then I instantly sent an email to a bunch of people and said, hey, you might see this on LinkedIn. This might look a little weird. I wanted you to be aware of this. Yeah. And if you believe in what I'm doing, can you reshare it, amplify it?
That's actually really well managed, to be fair. I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, it was.
And what happened?
It got 20 times the engagement of anything I had posted on LinkedIn up until that point.
There you go.
And so that was one big aha. But then the other aha was the direct messages.
Not that kind of engagement, like what the F are you talking about this on LinkedIn for? Not that kind of engagement. I don't think.
Oh, it was positive engagement.
Welcoming, yeah.
Yes, it was likes, it was positive comments. Thank you for sharing. I'm struggling too. And then the really interesting thing was to see who would reach out to me via direct messages or even in the hallway and say, hey, I saw that. I'm so happy you posted that because I'm struggling too. But a lot of those people were afraid to comment or even hit like on that post.
Right. If I comment on this and say, I have these same things too, am I putting my career at risk? These are real things.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And so that was my first aha was, okay, one, there is a hunger for this conversation. And then two, this is a bit of a beacon to a lot of people because the stigma is so strong. We think we're the only ones who are uniquely suffering.
Yeah.
And so
just as a parenthesis, something like 25% of people will have a depressive episode in their life. And I think, I can't remember, is it 15% at any one time are afflicted? That's just depression.
I'm not sure on depression. I know McKinsey ran a survey that said something like 59% of us, and this was looking, I think, at both anxiety and depression, have had at least one mental health challenge or have at least one mental health challenge.
Yeah. And
it's
not people who aren't incarcerated or in institutions. I mean, these are working people that are probably the data points in there. So those 59% of the people who are quote unquote making it. There's a whole bunch of people who ain't making it, who don't make it onto such surveys. So if you think about the numbers, considerably worse than that probably. And with the stigma around self-reporting, whatever the numbers say, I would be extremely suspicious. And I would suspect my hypothesis would be the numbers might be actually double the numbers that we find in the data from the CDC and the WHO and all those places. I guess.
Totally. If say 15 years ago, if you had given me a survey at work that you told me was to assess my mental health, I would probably be instantly trying to figure out how do I game this survey so it looks like my mental health is really solid because I don't know what you're going to do with this data.
Right. Yep. Right.
So back to the black hole. So that was like layer one of the black hole was, okay, cool. I'm going to start sharing my story. Layer two was, as I started talking to people, what I found was mental health was only the starting point for this conversation. So there were people struggling with depression and anxiety, some people with some conditions such as bipolar, where they really need professional help and they were hiding these things at work. But for the vast majority of people, what they really wanted to talk about was, I am really struggling to live a life that I want to live and work in the way that we work in this society.
Right.
So it was like, how do I build the life I want to live? with the way we're expected to work in the society? And like, I don't have any easy answers for that, but it was clear the gravity of the conversation was there. And so that was the next layer of the black hole, because like, wait, if I bring up that conversation, that starts to bring up questions about the organizations we work for and how they're run and how we run them.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
and we can't, and one of the things we can't do, well, I was at IBM and you're at Google, we can't publicly criticize our organizations, and perhaps we shouldn't, right? Perhaps we should have the tough conversations inside the organization where they matter, rather than having, it's like if you have a friend who's got a problem, you can either gossip about them behind their back or you can take it to them, right? And we should take the tough conversations to the organization. And it's such easier to flame and badmouth from the outside and not to have the tough conversation about what are we doing about this internally. Yeah.
I think is as long, again, while I'm edging into the black hole, I am of the philosophy, again, that the solution is never burn down the system. And so if I have that guardrail and I look at how, say, my employer is trying to help people to, like, yes, you joined Google. It's $1 trillion company that still has huge, huge ambitions. Like, that's the baseline. Like, it's hard to imagine that you had joined a Google and it's not going to be really challenging. And so underneath that, what they've said is, we acknowledge that, and we're going to do everything we can to try to help you take care of yourselves and your families. And we're going to create space to keep conversation going about how we do better. And so if your solution is not burn down the system, I'm like, I don't know how much more I could ask for. Like, this is pretty much a best case scenario.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. It's pretty good. Let me ask you a question. You and I don't live in a world where kind of like we give unsolicited freebie advice or something. That's not the way we roll in the personal development world. But say, there are someone, and there are many people who will listen to this will be perhaps wondering, first of all, whether they have mental issues. That would be one question. And then secondly, because it's hard enough to acknowledge those things to yourself.
Yes.
And then, but what would you say to someone who's where you might have been in January of 2020 or March of 2020, who's, hey, should I discuss this? Should I bring this up with my employer? Should I take some time? Should I seek a therapist? Like, what would your counsel be to this anonymous individual?
Two things. One thing that was critical was I talked to a lot of friends who had their own mental health struggles and had, before me, decided to be open about it. And so one, it did two things. One, it made me feel less alone. And then two, it just started giving me some full color examples of, okay, what does this look like? And their stories didn't sound that different from mine. And so that was my first aha of like, okay, maybe, and I was still pretty resistant, but maybe I might have some mental health struggles. The second was that I actually went maybe. I went to a therapist and got assessed, and I could have gone in online and done the same assessment that he had me go through, but I think the thing that
I think it's more real to say it to a human being,
Yes, I think
your PC is like whatever, but
it was that, and then he also has like a broad meta set of data of having talked to so many people. So after I saw my results, I was able to say like, well, orient me to the broader world. Like, what does this look like? And so,
so I just want to summarize. So first of all, you wanted to acknowledge it to yourself. So you have to be the self-honesty is almost a critical, without that, there's nothing sine qua non, got to say it to yourself. And the second thing was, I think you tackled it in a semi-private way through the EAP to talk to a therapist who's counseled, let's say many hundreds or maybe even many thousands of people who are in this kind of thing. And through that then, and I guess this third step really isn't a you may, in seeing a therapist, not need to take this third step, which is, to say I need some time off at work.
Yeah, I think even before the third step, so if I had to say it a little differently, like than the way you synthesized it, was a lot of, I think what those initial steps did for me was it made me feel like I'm not uniquely flawed.
Right.
Honestly, like that's the way I was feeling. It was like,
Yeah.
How did I, like, I have so much going on for me. How did I F this up? Like,
Yeah.
I'm the biggest F up in the world, and I'm hiding it from everyone.
Right. Yeah.
Once I talked to my friends about it, I could at least say, okay, maybe 5 of us are the biggest F-ups in the world. But that was enough for me to say, okay, I'm going to stop denying it and say, like, okay, humans end up here. Let's keep investigating. So then I started to accelerate. The other aha for me was when I went through that assessment, the therapist said to me, you are showing major symptoms of depression and anxiety. And that was, I like, my mind was blown. I said, like, what are you talking about?
Right.
And he said, like, well, you answered yes to these questions. And it wasn't like I was on the border. It was like, yeah, I've been having these thoughts for a long time. And so he said, I said, isn't this just what it's like to work hard? And he said, well, it can be that, but this is also depression and anxiety. And then my final aha, which really changed the conversation for me, was, again, something came out of my mouth that I couldn't unhear. I said, but I felt this way off and on since high school.
Right.
And that's where I had the aha of, I didn't even have the basic awareness of what this felt like or looked like, because I, was trained to suppress negative feelings and just power through it.
Of course. Achieve through it, I should say.
Achieve through it. And I had gotten applauded and rewarded for that.
Yeah, I mean, you went to Berkeley. I mean, you've had a very illustrious, pedigreed career trajectory, if I may say.
This is success in the good life.
Yeah.
And so, but once I said that, it's almost like you've had an injury, like you've had lower back pain for 20 years. And then finally a doctor says, your back's not supposed to hurt like that, right? If you do things differently. That was my aha of, like, wait a minute, I'm not supposed to be off and on, like overwhelmed with anxious thoughts, like feeling like I'm in a dark pit.
But everybody doesn't feel this way?
Yeah.
I thought this was normal. I mean, because it's the only thing you've ever known, right? And since we don't talk about these things, we don't have a benchmark with other people. In fact, I think you probably know, one of the things I say in my writing is we compare how we feel inside with the pictures of other people on the covers of magazines or in television, or living the dream and every day, another day in paradise, and all these these things. So it's actually worse because we think we're subnormal this way that we feel, but we can't talk about it. And anyway.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's, well, back to the statistics now, putting my foot in the black hole and starting this conversation and meeting more people who are struggling, what I'm finding is it turns out that many of us are struggling this way. And so my mindset is starting to flip to say, okay, like, I'm definitely not alone. I'm actually thinking that there's not a majority of us who might be struggling with our mental health, but it's a really large segment of the population.
Sure. Maybe not a majority, but a very large minority for sure. For sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I see a few things that are kind of flipping the conversation are, one, this ongoing work around people trying to just destigmatize a topic. I think it's working. And then 2, the data showing whether it's 20%, 50%, that's a huge segment of the population is struggling with mental health. Like, that number is starting to normalize it. It's like, I mean, if 1 out of 5 of us have back pain, like, I guess back pain's pretty normal.
Yeah, it's more common than cancer. And we throw a lot of money at trying to cure cancer. This is worse than cancer because this is systemic, much more systemic than cancer is. This is much more cultural. This is much more sneaky.
Yes.
So, well, very good. Very good. So I think we're in a good, so first of all, I think you and I agree on one thing. It's a lot better than it used to be. And I think, we've seen some ways that it's going to get better. But back on a personal note, so what are your laudable goals for this year with regard to mental health in the world, mental health at Google, frame it however you like?
I haven't put hard metrics around this, but I think sourcing more leads on public speaking events. So I'd like to do more public speaking.
Yeah.
the workshop I've been teaching around how you talk about mental health in the workplace and how you systematize that into things like meeting check-ins and things like that.
Is that public? Can people access this through whatever, LinkedIn or something like that? Or is it Google?
Not yet. So that's one of the goals is okay. I'm talking to some people about how might I change that into an e-course so it's easily accessible.
All right.
It's like the goal is how can I reach as many people so I can drive as much change as possible. And then let's see.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And then I think the final part where
speaking in the course, and then you got a third plank to your strategy.
The third plank to my strategy is I'm trying to evolve. Like the next foot into the black hole.
Yeah.
Is first it was just talk about mental health. Second was start to one was share my story. That was first foot into the black hole. Second was to start to consider openly some of these questions about how we live and work. I think the third one is I'm just trying to be extremely transparent now about to say, you know what? This was actually kind of gifted to me by someone who I think meant to criticize me. And as I've been speaking publicly about my mental health and, pretty visibly, someone in the organization, and this got back to me through various back channels, they lodged this question of, what is Newton doing? Does he have 1 foot in and 1 foot out? And they were referring to my role at Google. And my initial reaction, it was a little bit emotional. Like internally, I was like,
I can imagine. Yeah.
Like screw that person.
Screw that guy. Yeah.
But then I stopped myself and I'm like, okay, it's a fair observation. Like, why did I have that reaction?
Sure.
And when I interrogated that, what I came up with was the reason I had that reaction was because they're absolutely right. I do have 1 foot in and 1 foot out, but so does everyone else because we don't live our lives in the organizations where we work. Like sure. we live with 1 foot there doing that work and we live with 1 foot out trying to live our lives. But I'm just not going to hide it anymore. Instead, I want to show all the ways that those two things collide. Like where am I really successful in getting those things to work together? Where those things break down and I made poor choices that either hurt my role at work or hurt my role as a family man. And if I just start being really open about that, like what happens? And I don't think actually anything bad will happen to me because the same thing is happening with everyone.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to talk more and more about that.
And I think, listen, I'd have to guess, but I would have thought that you've done enormously positive things for Google's reputation in the world as an employer through your work. No question.
That is my hypothesis.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. I'm not sure. But, I theorize. One thing that I would wish, and maybe we'll close with this, your reflections on this. We have a way of greeting one another, which is in organizations, which is like when you pass someone in the hallway or whatever, you say, how are you? And we, first of all, don't really care. And we don't really want an answer. And if I could wave a magic wand, one of the things I would stop having that be a greeting. If you want to say hi, say hi. When you say how are you, it's not as if you said you really want to know. And I would want us to say that like really and sincerely and connectedly more. And I'd want the answer to be more. But most of the time, and I'm going to throw a number up in the air. They say 50% of statistics are made up in the moment. But so I'm going to throw in like 89% of the time people say, how are you? They don't give a shit. It's a perfunctory greeting. And so I would wish that our language would change. So when we say, how are you, we really mean, how are you? I don't also mean in workplaces that the only acceptable answer is living the dream, baby, another day in paradise. Sort of back slappy bro, it's all good in the hood, bro, that kind of thing. And I don't think that helps us. So what are your thoughts on that as we wrap up?
I love that. Maybe building on that, I think I'm on board with the hi. And then I'm on board with like, if I have specific questions like, how was your Christmas or something, or did you enjoy your vacation? Like, I'm okay with that. But if we say, how are you? I feel like I want a t-shirt that says, quote unquote, how are you? That's at least a 10-minute conversation. Would you like to have it?
Right.
Like, it's kind of like if my boss said, I need to review your quarterly strategy. I instantly think like at least a 30-minute meeting, probably more.
Right.
Like, why don't we set that same norm with the question, how are you? Because we'd actually connect and we'd actually discuss, or we'd, not devalue the question.
And that unlocked it all for you, that one question, right? That set in motion, we could argue, this whole unfolding for the last 2 years, right?
Yeah, that's true. It was someone asked and someone said, I want you to be real. And so I told them how I was really doing.
And so there you are. So we have the answer.
Yes, here we are.
But I really do think that one of the things you said to me in other conversations is that workplaces need to have the spaces, the structures, the processes, to use management speak. Gross. I know it's gross, but we need to have all that stuff so that people can say, how are you? And really want to know. And the person who's being asked can say really how it is. And I think that would be the great gift to the world, perhaps, of the work you've done in the last 2 years is some of that.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe we set another norm of either you 100% answer that question, or you say, I'm not going to answer that because there are things I don't want to tell a coworker.
Right.
It's like, let's be 100% honest.
I would never tell someone like you.
Yeah, maybe that's a less good idea.
Yeah. Well, it's great. And what about powerlifting this year? Are we going to compete? You're going to compete in the powerlifting world this year, or I got mad at you are, right? Why not, right?
Yeah, so I'm actually, so there's two major federations. There's the USA Powerlifting Association. I won their national championship for my weight class last year. There's also the US Powerlifting Association.
Yep.
They have like slightly different rules. So I'm doing a qualifier for their federation for their nationals. In about 3 weeks.
Okay.
And then I will try to compete at their nationals in Las Vegas in June. And I should be able to, I think, both win that nationals and then break a bunch of world records.
Amazing. Yeah. I don't know. Are you in your 40s, did you say?
I'm 45.
45, right. Well, you're not supposed to be doing shit like this. Yeah, you need to take more.
So my oldest competitor in the weight class that I've found is 30.
Right.
And then the ones who made nationals last year, they were both or second and third place. They were 23.
Right on.
So almost half my age.
Yeah. You teach those puppies a lesson. Well, look, thank you for spending the time on Think Bigger, Think Better. I think this will be a big one. I appreciate all of you for listening, and I appreciate Newton for being here. Thank you.